I have here a brick of a phone. This is an iPhone 6 South Plus. It came out in 2015, and this was like the most popular iPhone ever made. They sold more than 200 million of these puppies. And for the time, it was really innovative. I mean, you had Touch ID, you had a big screen, but today's youth probably wouldn't be caught dead using this thing. And that got me thinking, where did all the cool kids go? Where did they all disappear to? You know, one day they're here, everyone's using the latest iPhone and Android. And then suddenly, a couple years later, no one cares anymore. Well, turns out, we've been here before. The story of the phone goes way further back than you think. So let us take a journey back in time to see how the phone went from being cool to lame and back again. So if you thought Steve Jobs was the first person to come up with the idea of the smartphone, well, you'd be wrong. In fact, he wasn't even the second or third person. The very first smartphone was called the IBM Simon, and it came out in 1994. That's right, 9 years before Steve Jobs unveiled the original iPhone. Now, the IBM Simon wasn't exactly an apple-to-apple comparison to the modern smartphones we use today. For one, it only weighed 11 ounces. And second, it had a really bad battery life. You could only get about 2 hours of talk time. And it cost a whopping $899. So, yeah, it's no wonder only 30,000 people bought it. Still though, it was ahead of its time. It combined the functionality of a mobile phone, a PDA, and an early version of an internet-connected device, all into one. And it also featured a touchscreen, something we now take for granted on every smartphone, but at the time was super revolutionary. In fact, when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, he didn't just say it was a revolutionary product. He actually said it was a revolutionary product that combines 3 products into one: a widescreen iPod, a cell phone, and an internet communicator. He didn't mention it, but the IBM Simon did that already 13 years prior. Oh, and not only that, but the very first iPhone was literally a ripoff of the BlackBerry. BlackBerry had a bunch of patents on things like pinch to zoom and auto-erase text input, both of which Apple copied directly from them. Apple was so brazen about it all that they even offered BlackBerry a partnership, basically saying, hey, why do you and we work together and make the iPhone run on BlackBerry OS, instead of us having to reinvent the wheel? To their credit, BlackBerry actually turned down this once-in-a-lifetime offer because they were too busy suing someone else. But anyways, after BlackBerry rejected Apple's offer, Steve Jobs was forced to build his own operating system, which of course turned out to be iOS. And as we all know, that was pretty successful. But my point is that the modern smartphone, at least in terms of concept, is nothing new. We've been here before. In fact, there was another phone after the IBM Simon that was much more similar to the iPhone than the iPhone itself was. It was called the Nokia Communicator, and it came out in but opened up to reveal a full QWERTY keyboard and a big screen. And unlike the IBM Simon, it actually sold really well. Over 1 million of these sold by 2000. So good job, Nokia. The reason I'm talking about the Nokia Communicator is because it makes my point perfectly. If you look at a graph of smartphone sales over time, there are clear waves of innovation. First wave started in the 90s with the Simon and the Communicator, then died off in the early 2000s when people realized that the battery technology would never improve. Then the second wave started with the iPhone in 2007 and peaked around 2015, when everyone who was gone buy a smartphone did. And now that wave is dying off too, as we approach a saturation point. But you know what? There's a new wave coming, and it's led by a familiar face. Let's start off with some history. Back in 2011, Apple acquired a little company called PrimeSense, a company that specialized in fingerprint sensors. And in 2013, they introduced their flagship product, the G sensor. This sensor would eventually find its way into the iPhone 5 South and become the industry standard for smartphone fingerprint scanners. But Apple wasn't done quite yet. They continued working on improving the accuracy of their fingerprint scanners to the point where they could even scan a wet finger. Then in 2015, they filed a patent for under-the-display Touch ID. This patent described a future iPhone, where the home button would be entirely made up of a sensor. No longer would there be a physical button. Instead, the entire home button would be pressure-sensitive and capable of simulating a click-through haptic feedback. And finally, in 2016, Apple introduced the second generation of the iPhone 6, an homage to the iPhone 5 South that featured the latest processor but kept the old design. And that design, of course, included the old-school home button with Touch ID. Now, you may be wondering what any of this has to do with phones going from cool to lame and back again, and rightfully so. But just bear with me for a minute. The reason I bring up all of this old history is because Apple is in a really tough spot right now. On one hand, they have the iPhone, say, a phone that's objectively outdated, but sells extremely well because it's the cheapest iPhone they offer. And on the other hand, they have the cutting-edge iPhone 14, a phone that's packed with the best hardware money can buy, except no one wants to buy it. The Pro Max costs almost $1,000 now, and none of the upgrades really matter to the average consumer. Battery life, camera, processing power, they're all nice to have, sure, but they're not must-haves, and that's what Apple's problem is. They've reached a saturation point. They simply cannot introduce new features that are meaningful to the average consumer without drastically changing the form factor of the phone. Take the notch, for example. That was Apple trying to introduce a new feature, a better front-facing camera and facial recognition. But because they couldn't do it without creating a gigantic forehead on the phone. Instead, we ended up with the notch. And while the notch has since gotten smaller, it still isn't perfect and will never be perfect. Unless Apple does something drastic like getting rid of the selfie camera entirely. And this is where the Nokia Communicator comes in, because it shows us that there is a market for drastic changes. People want change, but only to a certain extent. Think back to the Nokia Communicator days. The original model came out in 1996, and it sold well until 2003 when Nokia released the Nokia 7700. The main difference between the two was that the 7700 was running on a more advanced operating system, Symbian, which allowed 4 more apps and functionality. In other words, it was smarter, but the downside was that it lost the physical keyboard, something people were used to from the previous model. Long story short, people didn't like the new design, so they stuck with the older model, and Nokia discontinued the 7700. Now keep in mind, this was long before the iPhone. This was in 2003. So the fact that Nokia was making smartphones in 2003 is pretty impressive. And the fact that they failed because people wanted a dumb phone shows that there's always going to be a market for simple phones. People don't want things to become too complicated. And that brings us back to Apple. They need to make a change, something that will force people to upgrade. But they also need to make sure that whatever change they make doesn't alienate their customer base. Something tells me they're going to try the same tactic they've used in the past. And if you're curious what that is, stay tuned to find out. Apple has always relied on doing things differently, on inventing completely new ways of interacting with their devices. The original iPhone didn't just have a screen and a keyboard. It had a revolutionary new way of navigating called multi-touch. The iPad didn't just have a bigger screen. It had a completely new way of interacting with apps. And the Apple Watch doesn't just tell the time. It has a new way of interacting with notifications. So what does that mean for the iPhone 15? Well, it means Apple needs to reinvent interaction yet again. And if you've been following tech at all over the past year, you know that Apple is currently testing something called Dynamic Island, a new way of interacting with notifications. But that's not all it is. It's a complete overhaul of the status bar. It combines your notifications, system alerts, and background activities in a single pill-shaped window. And it's so much more than just a status bar. It's an interactive component that lets you easily switch between apps, access timers, or control music playback. But that's still not all. It has also a contextual awareness engine that uses AI to show you relevant information based on what you're redoing. So if you're listening to music, it'll show you album art and playback controls. Or if you're navigating with Apple Maps, it'll show you turn-by-turn directions. Basically, it's like Siri, but proactive. It anticipates what you need instead of you having to ask for it. And just like every other major release before it, the iPhone 15 won't be an iPhone for everyone. Some people will prefer the simplicity of the status bar and the predictability of the notch. But those who embrace change will have a much better experience. That's how Apple's always done things. They've never been afraid of alienating a portion of their user base in order to move forward. And if that means leaving the past behind, well, so be it. If you want to learn more about Dynamic Island, check out this video. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.